Well, we hear a lot about dangers for young men in ministry. Let's look at the other side. What are the temptations, the weaknesses, the dangers for seasoned people in ministry?
He's talking about you, Russell.
That's right. That's right.
I suppose resting on your laurels, that you're not really progressing anymore. All of us have probably had those sad experiences of going to hear someone of acclaim and reputation from previous years, and then going to hear them and going, that seemed hollow. And you recognize someone who wasn't pressing forward and still learning. And that's easy to do because we get tired, and there are certain things for which we have received acclaim. And it's easy just to kind of keep returning to the familiar rather than pressing on in personal growth and understanding.
I think seeing the younger generation as a threat tends to happen. It's almost a reminder of one's own mortality. And there's a sense in which sometimes a bitterness can set in, and a disconnect, an undue criticism of younger preachers and pastors especially. And a nostalgic view of the past that's not realistic. But in my day, things were much better than they are now. They can lead to undue tension between older and younger preachers who need each other. And the younger preachers need to be discipled by the older preachers, but that means older preachers who are confident enough in their calling that they're willing to disciple.
I think of two things. It'd be great to have you guys respond to these. On one hand is the danger of familiarity, of just losing your awe along the way. I mean, we would argue that being graced with familiarity of the gospel is a beautiful thing. Being able to stand up close to the gospel as your life's work is beautiful, but it has dangers. There's something about the more you see something, the less you really see it. The more you're around something, the less you celebrate it. And one of the things I meant to pass to the next generation in ministry is awe of God. You know, one generation shall commend your greatness to another. On the other side is a rival, where knowledge, skill, and experience begins to define my maturity rather than what real maturity is about. Because I'm very seasoned, I'm very knowledgeable. I've been around the block many times. This is not my first rodeo. And it breaks up that thing that Paul said to Timothy, you know, one eye on your doctrine, one eye on your own life. I quit looking at my own life. So it would be great for you to comment on those two things, the loss of awe, that danger of familiarity, and the danger of a rival.
And I think there's a third thing that naturally flows with that, and that's a self-protectiveness from people who have been hurt in ministry. They're trying to avoid becoming bitter, but they've seen, talking about being around the block a lot of times, they've seen what can happen, and so there's a sense of distance. I'm really not going to pour my life into you because I've seen what has happened in the past. They can also lead to a numbness toward God. I think that's very, very easy to happen, where God simply becomes a bag of tricks that you're using in order to do certain things, but at a distance.
Right. I was thinking callousness, but I think numbness is better because nobody really wants to become callous. But you may actually want to be numb, so as not to be hurt or to be filled. You said it well. You don't want to be filled with bitterness nor hurt, and so numbness may be the alternative. And what you really want is to feel that old affection again, and that sense of how do I really claim the wonder that I once had. And we all go through that at times. We look back and say, I remember when I really was on fire or felt the love or was moved. And I long for those moments, maybe we all do now, when you kind of feel the tears in a time of worship, or you're moved by someone's testimony. And you think, we're all maybe a few years in ministry now, you think, oh, it's been a while since I felt that as deep. I really long to feel it deeply. And I suppose that's a good sign, to long to feel it again, and then to rejoice when you do.
And maybe there's another thing it's letting my guard down and permitting subtle areas of sin into my life that I wouldn't have younger in ministry, wouldn't have younger in the Lord. It's sort of what we all would sadly say we experience in marriage, where we permit ourselves to do things in marriage that we wouldn't have thought of doing in in courtship, and so I become dull to those things in my own life. And the danger with that is you always carry that heart into your ministry. You can't. That's your heart. You can't leave it at the door.
Yeah.
We're going into a new ministry, and some of the things you were saying, Russell, are kind of touching me, because I was thinking, Kathy and I have said to each other, we've been with a group of people for almost 3 decades, and now we're saying we can't fail to pour ourselves into another group of people. We can't fail to love these people. But at some point you say, can we? You actually wonder, can we do it again?
Yeah.
And there we just have to pray that the Lord would give us those open hearts and say, love again and be open again. And you can't just protect yourself and be effective in ministry. You have to be vulnerable with these people.
So what would you say to the person who's been around ministry long enough to be afraid and to not want to be open and pour into people like that? What would your counsel be?
It gets worse if you don't. What's the alternative to loving deeply? It's not being loved deeply. And so the risk is worth it, even though it's still a risk. It always will be, but it's impossible to minister without loving deeply at a level of risk. And the alternative is that you just don't receive in return, I suppose.
And I think it can lead to some conviction of a Messiah complex. I remember being in this wallowing of self-pity because of a discipling effort that I had made that didn't work. And I remember just kind of wallowing in self-pity about that, and then asking myself, what is different about me than the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter and Jesus himself? I mean, part of what it means to be in this world and on this mission means having those things happen. And there's a sense in which sometimes we can have such an exalted view of our own place that we don't expect those things to happen.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that this conversation excites in me is we need to have this conversation more. There's a lot of seasoned people in ministry who are reticent to talk about the real heart struggles of ministry. It seems so dramatically unspiritual to be this place in ministry, but we all know they're there. Thanks.